All right, everybody, we are going to talk today about intermolecular forces, also called van der Waals forces. This is going to be interactions that take place between different types of molecules. So we'll take a look at dipole moments, hydrogen bonding, electrostatic attractions. We will compare the strengths of different intermolecular forces, and then we'll figure out what types of intermolecular forces occur, given a few examples. Firstly, though, we need to talk about the difference between intra and intermolecular forces. So intramolecular forces are forces that occur within molecules, and so these would be things like covalent bonds where you're sharing, ionic bonds where you're transferring electrons and you have that full charge and then that electrostatic attraction, or metallic bonds where you have a sea of electrons. This is in comparison to our intermolecular forces that occur between molecules. And so we have interactions between polar and polar molecules, polar and nonpolar, or nonpolar and nonpolar. And so we look at things like hydrogen bonds, London dispersion forces, dipole-dipole interactions. The reason why this matters is because whenever we look at how different materials interact, we're looking at things like enzymes and substrates. So why does the substrate bind to the active site? There's going to be intermolecular forces that help to hold it there. We also have things like the structure of DNA. And so we have hydrogen bonds between those nitrogen bases, and that's going to allow DNA to stay together, but then also allow it to break and reform whenever replication takes place or transcription takes place. We also look at intermolecular forces with how do we taste things, or how do we send a signal from our brain down to muscles, how do the receptors interact with one another. The basis of a lot of intermolecular forces, whenever we look at this, is going to be looking at polarity and then the Coulombic attraction or the Coulombic forces. Those are going to be how basically the same charges repel and opposite charges attract. So if we look at different types of intermolecular forces, we have the London force, which would be two nonpolar or non-charged, and this will occur whenever there are temporary dipoles or induced dipoles. So temporary dipoles will occur, and you'll have temporary charges that will hold molecules together. We also have a dipole-induced dipole, which is not included on here, but dipole-induced dipole is going to take place between a polar and a nonpolar molecule, and the polar molecule will bring a charge or induce a charge on the nonpolar. We have two dipole-dipole, which will be two polar molecules. This will be relatively strong. And then a special type of dipole-dipole is a hydrogen bond. That happens in molecules that contain hydrogen bonded to fluorine, oxygen, and nitrogen. And so these are very strong. They are going to be the strongest of the intermolecular forces, excepting maybe this ion dipole. So ion dipole is going to take place between an ion and polar molecule, and this is going to be responsible for dissolving ionic compounds. If we look at London dispersion forces, again, this happens between two nonpolar molecules, and what you see is that you have this instantaneous uneven distribution of electrons, and it's going to induce this other nonpolar atom, to then have a charge. And so then they're going to have this attraction between the partial positive and partial negative. That would be the Coulombic attraction, and you're going to have then an interaction. What we find with London dispersion forces as well is that as we increase the mass, then we're going to increase the boiling point. And then as we increase the surface area, or basically the contact area, we're also going to increase the boiling point. We also have dipole-induced dipoles. So we have our polar molecule, which has a permanent charge, partial positive and partial negative, and then we have a nonpolar molecule. What we have is whenever they get into close proximity, then that partial negative on the polar molecule induces there to be a partial positive on the other molecule, and then you have an attraction that helps keep them together. These are going to be typically slightly stronger than the London dispersion forces, but not quite as strong as something like the dipole-dipole, which is going to occur between two polar molecules. If we have something like this, what you see is that we have the balance between where we have positive and negatives attracting, and then positives and positives repelling. And so there will be a balance between that, but dipole-dipole are typically going to be a little bit stronger. Stronger than that will be hydrogen bonds, and so this is going to take place if hydrogen's bonded to oxygen, fluorine, or nitrogen. The strength is going to be pretty high, but it's not going to be quite as high as a covalent bond. It's still only 2 to 5% strength compared to a covalent bond. There's going to be higher melting and boiling points between molecules that have similar molecular weights. So water is polar. There are going to be hydrogen bonds versus methane, which is nonpolar. And so methane is going to have low melting point and boiling point versus water is going to have a high melting point and boiling point. So if you take a look at these, you can draw them out with Lewis structures, determine if they are polar or not, and then determine what types of forces occur between them. So here are the different types of forces. The first one is polar, specifically hydrogen bonds. Then you're going to have the next two, hydrogen with hydrogen or methane with methane, will be London dispersion forces. Water and ammonia will be hydrogen bonds. Ammonia and methane will be dipole-induced dipole, and then methane and hydrogen will be London dispersion forces. Please let me know if you have any questions.